Okay, so that was the bloody, crazy, fascinating history of what was the first French Revolution. Now, this, as I say, is overlapping things that we've already looked at. So you'll recall our old friend here, Jacques-Louis David, and this particular painting of his, The Oath of the Hierati. All right, we looked at it very briefly last time as an example of neoclassicism, and it certainly is that, but it also was meant as a propaganda piece for the French Revolution. Jacques-Louis David was all about the revolution, right? He becomes a big proponent of the ideas that are being touted by the revolution. And he's trying to convince people to come and join up. Now, 1783, 1784, when this is painted, the revolution hasn't begun yet, right? At this point, the fervor has only just begun. Meanwhile, over in the in the colonies, in the newly liberated colonies, what we know as the U.S. government had not been put in place yet at this point in time, right? But they're still watching what's happening over there in what would become the United States, and dig what's happening there, and don't so much dig what they're going through in their own lives in France. And so Jacques-Louis David uses this story from ancient Rome as a propaganda piece, as a way of calling everyone to join the fight. So we have this story here, without me getting too involved in it. We have over here a father, Roman father. This is a story from ancient Rome. And the Hierati would be the three brothers here, who their father is about to send the three of them off to war. And holding up three swords in his hands, he is asking for his three sons to swear an oath to Rome that they will lay down their lives for the Roman Republic, right? And all three brothers have their hands out in a salute of oath, but also kind of reaching for a sword, and they all three embrace one another, ready to fight if it means their own deaths, right? While over here to the right, we have the swooning women who, for them, this is not the great heroic thing that it seems to be for the men over here. For these women, it's all about the possibility that they could lose their husbands, or these children right here could lose their fathers. That's sort of a side note, right? And with it being David, he's almost suggesting that what these guys are going to go through on the battlefield is worth what's happening there with the women. But again, the neoclassical stuff that I talked about, right? This is all very influenced by ancient Rome. I mean, it's an old story from ancient Rome, and the Roman architecture in the back, but then also everything about this is based in sturdy geometry, specifically triangle, and if not a perfect triangle, at least the number 3. There are three arches here. The brothers, each of the brothers, their legs spread in the way that they are, is essentially a triangle. And then there are 3 brothers. There are 3 swords, and they sort of form a triangle. There may only be one father, but look at him. He's essentially a triangle. These 2 women, as they fall into one another, are a triangle. Even the mother back here with the 2 children is essentially a triangle, right? There's all these 3s. Everything is sturdy and grounded. None of it looks like it's got a chance to truly like fall over, right? And again, this would have been put out there as a means of advertising. Like, look, people, you need to rise up and fight. Join our ranks, right? We can do this. We can overthrow the monarchy. We can create a society of equals. Come and join even if it means your own death. It should be worth it for what will come after. Then, as we mentioned, or as was mentioned in that video you just watched, here is Jacques-Louis David's sketch of what was going to eventually be a huge history painting. Let me move here, of the tennis court oath, right? He didn't get this finished, unfortunately, but he has included portraits of almost every person of important significance, right? And it is the moment that everybody's being asked to make the oath. Look here, and you'll see the same kind of outstretched arm in a gesture of oath as you saw in the oath of the Hirate, right? And then he has taken place in the tennis court as it did, but he has taken all of the people involved and shoved them down very low. There are some people up here, right? There are people who sort of got into these upper balconies and windows in order to be present. But there's this big, huge wall right here that is open, and it's up above. I mean, we even have our main centralized figure pointing up into it. It's high. It's above all the heads. It is an ideal, right? It's a grand idea that is bigger than all of us, for us to swear our allegiance to and fight for. And that's no doubt what he ends up using this large space up here for. But just in case, he also has this window that's being blown open and a little bolt of lightning off in the distance, which again is the idea, sparking, shocking, coming into the world and striking it. But also, as I mentioned, he painted a lot of propaganda during this. It's 1793 when he paints this piece, and the French Revolution is deep in the thick of it at this point. And he's done this painting here of Marat, the death of Marat. Marat was a revolutionary who sadly suffered from skin ailments and had to spend pretty much all of his time in a bathtub that was just to soak and take care of all the skin blemishes he had. And he did a lot of his revolutionary writings from that bathtub. But now, you just watched that video, at least I hope you did, and so you're familiar now that the guillotine became the execution method of choice of the revolution, and Marat was also not shy about writing down lists of people in government who needed their heads swiftly excused from their bodies, if you will. And so an assassination attempt was made, a successful assassination attempt was made. He was killed while in his bathtub one day. So this angers the hell out of David, who knows, anybody who was on the fence about joining up with the revolution, they should know this is something they need to see. And he paints Marat as, interestingly, an unblemished individual. His skin is pure. He has died from the stab wound to the heart, but has done so in a way that's almost picturesque, almost beautiful. He's in his bathtub with his sort of writing platform that he had in front of him for writing. And you got to love the story that's being told here. He was in the middle of writing revolutionary ideas when he was stabbed. The knife is here, having been, the murder weapon having been dropped before the assassin fled the scene. And look, he did the same thing again that he did with the tennis court oath. He put this large area up here, right? He took the main focus of the painting and put it down low. So there's this big open area, which again is symbolic of the ideas. Like the ideas, fill that space with what you will. We're working toward a higher goal, would be David's way of thinking. As a proponent of the French Revolution, Jacques-Louis David was also a huge fan of Napoleon Bonaparte and made a ton of propaganda for him, both during the revolution and after he had crowned himself Emperor of France. David stuck with him, even when suddenly Napoleon had made himself a dictator rather than the democratically elected leader that the French Revolution wanted. But here you see him portraying Napoleon as this great leader, able to control this wild beast that he has, and pointing onward, like, follow me, go, we fight, right? And by suggesting that when Napoleon crossed the Alps, he was stepping in the same footsteps as Hannibal, going back to another ancient story of Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with elephants. He wasn't the only artist. We have an artist that we'll look at again in more in depth in a bit, Jean-Auguste Dominique ENG, who is here painting Napoleon as an emperor. Right, he had crowned himself, had coronated himself the Emperor of France this time, and pretty much immediately started trying to conquer an empire by expanding outward from the more centralized France. And how does he paint him? He paints him as a Roman emperor, or even something akin to the Pope. All the grandeur of these clothing, of the clothing that he's wearing, the sort of olive leaf crown, that's a Roman thing. That's not so much of a French thing. We, in fact, don't see a lot here that is indicative of France per se. Instead, we see a leader who's being painted as a Roman emperor, someone of great wealth and power. And that's the way Napoleon wanted to be seen. Now, let's talk about then how this is all sort of affecting the art, if you will. So, late in the 17th century, so let's back it up a bit. Both England and France had developed royal academies of art in order to remove the power of the artist guilds and put the legitimacy of art firmly in the hands of the government. This was happening again in the 1600s. In England, this took the form of the Royal Academy of Art in London. And in France, this took the form of the Académie Royale. I'm not even going to try because I will butcher the French. The Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris. Now, what were the functions of these academies? They're not just schools. These are not necessarily the way we might think of an academy today as a place where one goes to receive training. Their main goal was to have official approval and legitimization of artists. They wanted a government institution that could determine you are an artist, you, sir, are not an artist. They wanted something like that in place. They also created, because it makes, of course, a government bureaucracy would do this. They came up with what is known as the hierarchy of subject matter. Right? We've already talked about several different types of genres, right? That really only became particularly popular in the 1600s, once you had a lot of Protestant artists who were having to appeal to a Protestant audience that wasn't looking for a lot of religious work. These genres had never really been like ranked. But now suddenly the Royal Academies come along and they start putting together like this type of genre is greater than this type of genre and that type of genre. We'll see in a moment, but there's a hierarchy to it. And then they establish rules for each of those genres, right? If you want to make a still life, it has to be done this way. If you want to make a landscape, it has to be done this way, and so on. Then they would standardize academic training. Now, some training sure was done in the Royal Academies, but there were other schools that taught art. But since it was now these government institutions that could decide whether or not you were a legitimate artist, the academic training of the time had to make sure that what they were teaching was in line with what the academies wanted, or else they'd be cranking out these students who would not be able to find work because they weren't doing what the academies had asked of them. So by the mid-18th century, the academies had begun to challenge the power of the saloniers with the salons that they put in place, called that we'll refer to as the official salons, right? So the saloniers, they've been doing their things, right? They've been having their private salons, and that, you'll recall, is where Rococo art was really being touted, right? The Academy, on the other hand, is going to lean very heavily into what they see as professional and not amateur art. Specifically, around this time, that would be neoclassicism, and challenge those private salons that the saloniers were having. All right, so the hierarchy of genres. All right, this is something that was put into place by both the French and the Royal Academy, and there are rules again for each of these. So, at the bottom of this hierarchy is still life, because this is their language and not mine. Okay, if you're gonna paint still lives, all you're doing is just kind of mimicking the surfaces of these inanimate objects, right? And it's impressive and all, but there's much more impressive stuff you could be doing. Then, above that was animal painting. I guess painting animals, because they're more animate, was considered a higher genre than still life. Then landscape painting, right? Landscapes get ranked where they do because they don't necessarily require human figures, and there's somewhat less technical ability to produce them than do the first three genres that we'll get to on the list. But landscapes, again, as I mentioned, also the Academy says, all right, that's number 4 in the ranking, but also that there are certain rules if you're going to paint a landscape. And one of those rules that has fascinated me, because I know people who still adhere to this, even to this day, is that for there to be a landscape, you need to have essentially 3 bands of color: blue, green, and brown. And even though what we're looking at here is not it's not technically a landscape, this is a history painting, which we'll talk about in a moment. But even this has it, right? Like the top portion is blue, the middle portion is green, the bottom portion is brown. And that was like a hardline rule in the academies. Then genre painting. You'll remember genre paintings, painting of everyday life. That comes in as just above landscape painting, because genre paintings were admired for the skills that artists employed, but they didn't command the respect that history painting or portraiture commanded. Right? Number 2 comes in as portraiture, because there was this rigorous coursework of instruction of instruction in order to master skills, where you would spend years drawing from plaster casts of people, and then you would copy the portraits of other people. So any of you in this class who are art students, imagine if you came to my class and rather than getting to draw from observation, I was like handing you drawings that I had made and said, now you draw that. That's the way the instruction was done in the sort of standardized way that the Royal Academies came up with. Then you could finally start working with live models. And then at the top ranking genre is history painting. History painting represented the culmination of all the skills that were learned within the academy system. And there are, again, rules. History paintings need to be very, very large. They can't be small. They've got to be super large. And none of these other genres should be painted at as large of a scale as history paintings. Then one of the things I mentioned to you in the last lecture was that at least in France, there was a rule. Here we're back to that unfinished painting I was talking about, right? We looked at this Jacques-Louis David the sketch for this painting, the tennis court oath. But I mentioned in the last lecture that at least in France, there was this hardline rule that if it's a history painting, the drawing underneath, any figures in the drawing that you put down first, must be nude, because that's meant to showcase the skill set and the level of skill that you have reached in this systematic art education that has been legitimized by the Royal Academies. You must do it that way. Again, that's why, at least in France, women could not be history painters, because women were not allowed to learn how to draw from nude models. It was not allowed. Now, however, in England, there wasn't that same rule that the figures must be drawn nude and then clothing painted on top of them. That's what allowed for Angelica Kauffman to participate as a history painter in England. But yeah, so you see here. Oh, and by the way, this painting was unfinished because, you just watched that video. You know that things didn't go particularly well for this revolution, and he had to flee. I believe he was painting this in Paris. He had to flee because his studio was being raided, and so the painting never got finished, which is particularly great for those of us wanting to study this stuff, because we can look at this and see that he had drawn all those figures underneath nude, and that we can assume that any other history paintings of his that we've ever seen, the figures underneath are nude. The salons that I was just talking about, the salon, right? The salon as opposed to the private salons. Beginning in 1725, the Salon was the official art exhibition of France. Between 1748 and 1890, it was the greatest annual or biannual, depending on what was going on in the world at the time, art event in the Western world. An artist who was wanting to be accepted into the Salon must first be a member of the Academy. And in order to be a member, one had to work within those established rules that we talked about. They must be deemed worthy by a panel of high-ranking people in the Academy. Or they can be brought in by acclamation, meaning they didn't necessarily apply, but the artist is already so well known in their own right that the Salon didn't want to be seen as completely unaware of the greatness of this artist. So they might say, this panel might get together and say, hey, has anybody heard of Jericho over here? Jericho is making some really great work. The masses seem to love him, right? We need to go ahead and accept him as a member of the Academy so we can legitimize that. Rather, before this becomes a problem and everybody starts saying, well, if this guy is so great and he's not part of Academy, why are we worrying about the Academy? Right? Early on, women were not admitted into the Academy at all because of course. But eventually, women were allowed to exhibit in the salons, but they were barred from competition for prizes. Yeah. So the salon, that photo, that image you see down there is a painting of the salon. The salon would be held in a large space, usually in a palace, in Paris. And as you can see there, like the paintings would just be stacked and stacked and stacked and stacked, right? It would be the annual exhibition of the paintings that the Academy deemed to be the best of the year. Paintings and sculpture, of course, because that was their thing. And that would go on display. People would come from all over Europe to participate and pay an admittance fee and go in and see all of this work. And it behooved you as an artist to be a member and to be accepted into one of the salons, because that would make your name, because you would be considered legitimate, and now people would start seeking you out as an artist. You can see, however, that there might be people who would find that way of handling things when it comes to art. Let me ask you, do you want the government to be able to tell you that what you enjoy creating is or is not art? Let's see what that leads to in the next part.